It's hard to talk about Stanley Brouwn. Despite steady interest in his work, Brouwn shunned the media for most of his life, refusing to give interviews or provide personal biography to art institutions. He also heavily restricted access to his work, requesting that it be neither photographed nor replicated. And finally, he asked that his work be neither discussed nor publicly interpreted. As you can imagine, these kinds of requests create a lot of debate in the art world. How do we discuss someone who actively withdrew from the conventional structures of biography, commercialization, and linear art historical narratives? As curators, do we prioritize the requests of the artists or our pedagogical responsibility to the audience? Is it possible to understand Brown's work without our standard tools of analysis and typical ways of representing artists' work? I'm your host, Donna Honarpisheh, and this is ICA Miami's Tomorrow is the Problem. Each episode of this season, we're exploring a different conceptual artist who teaches us to visualize the invisible, question the unquestionable, and unlearn what we thought we knew. Today we're talking about Stanley Brouwn, an artist who does not want to be talked about.
I think the most difficult challenge is that Stanley Brouwn kind of refused to provide any autobiographical information about himself.
This is Adrienne Edwards, the Ingalls Speyer Family Senior Curator and Associate Director of Curatorial Programs at the Whitney Museum.
So it's kind of, we have almost like the barest of bones of things to refer to in terms of understanding who he is and where he comes from. We also don't have any indication of his motivations for making work or what he was thinking about, because he didn't really speak about that. And then further, he did not allow for reproductions of his work. So even in exhibition catalogs, you didn't have biographical information, and you also didn't have reproductions of what the work is, which makes it incredibly complicated, whether you're interested in his work or curious about it, or a curator who's interested in it and wanting to write about it. Makes it very challenging.
Brown's requests to not replicate his work, include biographical information, or publicly analyze his work puts us in a difficult position. Should we follow his instructions at the cost of understanding his work? Or should we analyze and discuss his art and miss out on the experience Brouwn intended for his audience? His instructions, if followed, allows people to experience Brown's art free from the influence of context, something increasingly rare in this day and age. Think about how many times you pre-experience a piece of art before you actually see it in person. You hear people talking about it, you see pictures of the exhibit on social media, maybe you even watch an interview where the artist talks about making the piece. For better or worse, these moments shape how we interact with art. Sometimes this context can overwhelm the experience of the art itself and predetermine your own interpretation. Brown's instructions strip all that away. His work, or rather the unique experience of his work, takes on new relevance in our current era of instant information. Still, to truly appreciate Brown's art and his instructions around it, we should try to understand what motivated his withdrawal. Was it a desire to create a sense of mystique around his identity as an artist? Was it a means of attaining autonomy over how and where his work would circulate? Or rather, was it an effort to undermine the linearity of art historical narratives that construct the story of an artist during and after their life? Either way, Brown's gestures of withdrawal and opacity and his simultaneous acts of creation and destruction have become part of his artistic legacy.
So I think his destruction of those works is really interesting because it's not like he destroys all works before a certain date. He destroys all works except for This Way Brouwn.
That's Ellen Feiss, an assistant professor of modern and contemporary art at Providence College. Artists destroying their own work is nothing new. For some artists, destruction is an act of creation. Famously, John Baldessari burned all of the paintings he made between May 1953 and March 1966, and then baked the ashes of his art into cookies. More recently, Banksy auctioned off a painting that self-shredded the moment it was purchased. However, while we can't be sure of Brown's motivations, it seems like he destroyed his work not to create new art, but to seize control of his persona and the narratives that circulate and overdetermine the experience of an artist's work.
So it's a very conscious construction of his oeuvre. It's a negation, but it's also a formation or a finessing or a very deliberate construction of his oeuvre and of his profile as an artist. He does that in the early 70s at the same time he begins the biographical mandate. So at the same time that he's like, I'm not going to do interviews, or I'm going to do very few interviews. You can't circulate images of me. You can't reproduce my artistic CV in any catalog. At the same time, he also destroys all these works aside from This Way Brown. So he's very deliberately constructing what is available to the world about him and of him as an artist.
We can also understand Brown's attempts to, quote, construct his oeuvre or control his narrative in relationship to the then emerging field of conceptual art. This brings us to theory 2. Brown's self-erasure was a way of dematerializing and desubjectivizing his art. Dematerialization, a cornerstone in conceptual art, is the process of making the material, the physical manifestation of the art, less important than the idea behind the art. Desubjectivization refers to removing the artist from the art. Here's Annie Ochmanek, a writer, art historian, and editor, to tell us more.
I think what's important is it's rather a deliberate and complex engagement with the art world and its mechanics. So the work calls for us to kind of do the same or not take for granted the way in which we do things. So in the initial moment in which Brown made that decision, the art market was metabolizing this new form of art, conceptual art, which took this dematerialized, quote unquote, relatively dematerialized, we could say, form where art consisted more or less of an idea, not so much in an aesthetic object. And the artist's figure paradoxically became more important, or took on this kind of new significance in that moment. So this is paradoxical because the changes in the artwork were being said to do away with subjective authorship or expression and opting for a more anonymous process, or taking out a subjective input in the process of composition using predetermined systems. But at the same time, a lot of artists who are making that type of work are making claims about desubjectivizing their work. In the 60s, were also, in many instances, defending their work themselves, whether through writings, publishing in art magazines and journals, publishing art criticism of other people's work, giving talks, speaking on panels, going in person to install their work and kind of be with it. So Brown was pointedly not doing those things.
Another theory behind Brown's actions, in particular his withholding of biographical information, is a bit more complicated. To understand why Brown withheld so much information about his identity, we have to talk about his identity. Since Brown stopped giving interviews, we only have a handful of facts available to us. Stanley Brown was born and raised in Suriname. He immigrated to the Netherlands in 1957. His most prominent works were created in Amsterdam during the 1960s and 1970s. He was a professor at the University of Fine Arts Hamburg, and he passed away in 2017.
There's a big effort to incorporate marginalized figures in the history of contemporary art, right? Like women, queer artists, BIPOC artists. And the question of their biography is always a huge issue. Like, do you interpret an artwork in relationship to someone's quote-unquote identity? Do you differentiate between identity and subject position? Do you differentiate between their theorization of identity and the facts of their biography? So in the interpretation of work by Black artists, there was often this kind of one-to-one relationship between quote-unquote experience, their experience of their race, their experience in the world, and their work.
Brown's self-erasure was a disruption of the ways in which the art world continues to represent identity as a key feature of an artist's work. We can read these acts of self-erasure as a radical new form of self-expression, one on Brown's own terms. By subverting traditional biographical signifiers, he forces his audience to understand identity through a more historical context. It's like he's cutting himself out of a photo to draw more attention to his surroundings. To understand what it would have been like to be Surinamese in the Netherlands, we have to take a look at the painful history of colonialism between the two countries. The Netherlands colonized Suriname in the 17th century. One of the Dutch colonizers named Stedman kept a travel log about his experience. Here's Adrienne to tell us more. As a warning, there are very graphic descriptions of racialized violence. If you want to avoid this, please skip ahead 3.5 minutes.
It says, as they drew near the town, they came upon a Negro lying on the ground wearing only half his clothes. That is to say, a pair of blue cotton drawers. This poor man had no left leg and no right hand. Good heavens, said Candide. To him, in Dutch, what are you doing there, my friend, in that horrible state? I am waiting for my master. Was it Monsieur Vanderdoor who treated you this way? Yes, sir, said the Negro. It is the custom. So I found that quote kind of extraordinary because no system of enslavement is a good thing. They're inherently cruel and dehumanizing. But the Dutch system in Suriname was known to be particularly hideous. And so you had in Stedman's travelogue with these wonderful etchings by William Blake, incredible titles for each of them. And some of those titles were A Negro Hung Alive by the Ribs to a Gallows, Flagellation of a Female Sambo Slave, The Execution of Breaking on the Rack. I mean, these are like graphic portrayals. And it gives you a different context for understanding the fragility of a body, that this is a context in which the body is made to come apart, is made to disintegrate. And so to be both of value, this is the oxymoron, meaning you buy, you purchase an enslaved person, and also terribly undervalued through the process of brutality and violence. And so I was really intrigued by that in relationship to reading it with Stanley Brown's withholding. Like, there are different stakes associated with understanding a vulnerability of a body, and that if that visual readiness is so easy to entangle in these sort of systems of violence, that we might have a different understanding. Brown is like displacing an I in the work, right? Like this thing that's so associated with modernism, right? The modernism imperative of the individual and a certain agency. And he gives that up.
By withdrawing, or as Adrienne puts it, quote, displacing the I, Brown gave himself a certain artistic mobility. That's not to say that Brown's work avoids reckoning with his racial and ethnic identity. Far from it. Instead, Brown uses this self-negation, this deliberate displacement of the artist, to ask the audience to find new ways of seeing those identities.
Like, I can't track through any documents, any way to verify the question of race for Brown. But if I could attend to time and history and the dynamics of capitalism, just that process of speculation gave me a kind of fullness and roundness of a context from which Brouwn arrives to us that might actually tell us something about the work that no one was saying. And so what that meant was thinking about the fact that he was from Suriname. What does it mean to be from Suriname? And then when he leaves in 1957 and goes to the Netherlands, well, what is it like to be Surinamese in the Netherlands in 1957? We know that between that time and, say, the early 60s, the population of Afro-Surinamese was around 4,000 to 8,000 people in Amsterdam out of millions of people. So you would have been a real, let's just say, visual outlier in that context. So when you think about that in relationship to Brouwn and a project like This Way, Brouwn, it shifts the stakes of it entirely.
This Way, Brouwn is Stanley Brown's least hidden work. He didn't destroy it or restrict imagery of it. You can easily find photos of it online or articles analyzing its meaning. This Way, Brouwn is an example of participatory art. To create the piece, Brouwn would walk around Amsterdam with pieces of paper in his hand. He'd approach strangers and ask them for directions.
He would stop someone on the street and he would ask them for directions from where they were to a different place in the city. So from A to B, we could say. And he asked them to draw their directions on a piece of paper. And then he would take that drawing and he would stamp it with the phrase, "This Way, Brouwn." And he exhibited those drawings. And the drawings are really great because what you get is really unlike any other representation of space that we're accustomed to. It shows a personal view inside someone's head of the space in which they're oriented, their kind of mental landscape of the city and how to get somewhere. It also shows that the maps that we're sort of used to, the way the cityscape is planned or laid out for us, is actually different from how we chart our own way through it. And they have this very subjective, strange quality. None of them look alike.
Much like Charles Gaines, Stanley Brouwn had a knack for turning the objective into the subjective. Gaines used graphs and formulas to disguise rather than communicate information. Brouwn created maps that offer no sense of direction. They make the city of Amsterdam feel confusing and unfamiliar, even to a resident. By displacing knowledge and any clear sense of direction, Brouwn creates a work that attunes us to the experience of space and movement rather than the end of a location.
The beauty of it is that we have no idea what happened in those encounters. And if you look at the drawings, there's no way that they could get you from point A to point B. There's just something like so abstract about them, like they don't have street names. It's just like lines and circles. And so it leads me to really think that the actual piece is not the drawing at all. The actual piece are all of these encounters that can never be made available to us.
They're artifacts of an interaction we did not witness. The onus is on us, the audience, to imagine the creation of these drawings. How did these Dutch direction givers feel about Brouwn approaching them, declaring his foreignness both through his appearance and through his state of being lost? Were they annoyed? Empathetic? Did they condescend to him? Were any of them fellow immigrants?
It's like the walking up to people in public squares and asking for directions would have been quite a distinct experience. And to sort of disassociate, as he asked us to, I would just say that he withheld it, this history and that reality. I mean, in the press at the time that he moved there was an overwhelming amount of grievance and concern around the Surinamese coming to the Netherlands. and what was happening in the city. They were seen as culturally very distinct. So it's like, how do we as a scholar, and for me, this is more about my work as a scholar, as an academic, as opposed to a curatorial project, which gave me some freedom to wonder in it and to wander in a very Brownian way in it, to just imagine what that would have been like.
There's something paradoxical about This Way Brown. When you describe it, it sounds like performance art. However, it's presented only as visual art. It feels incomplete, deliberately so.
I feel like in the context of visual art, with someone like Stanley Brown, who is not really discussed in relationship to performance and visual art, but I would argue indeed really is probably one of the signal artists investigating the interconnectedness between them. It was a space performance within the visual arts where artists could make and explore and create and be outside of the market. I don't know that that's the case so much anymore, but certainly during earlier parts of the 20th century, mid-20th century, I would say even up until the late, I feel like this is a really 21st century phenomenon, performance and its relationship to the art market or the institution. It really existed outside of that. And so he's already placing a certain kind of value or a preference by choosing to make that kind of work in a vector that exists separately from a kind of market or institutional context.
Brown further played with this idea of subverting the art market by signing and stamping This Way Brown on each drawing, even though he was not the one to draw them. This declaration of authorship on a participatory piece both reflects the idea that This Way Brown is a self-portrait of sorts, and Brown's subtle challenge of institutionalized authority.
But I think it's really disruptive to have somebody say that there's a body of work. The drawings, he signs them, he stamps them This Way Brown, and yet he didn't draw them, right? So it's like this question of what is it that an idea can do and how far can you take an idea? And actually, is the idea in and of itself adequate? Like, is the idea felicitous? Can I be compelled by it? So it's never just about those drawings in terms of like the fact that there's a performance that happened in as much as he premeditated the encounter, right? He's choosing people. He's deciding to be in the street. He's saying where he wants to go. Can you draw this? And then how that work gets presented and circulated as his.
Having someone else create the physical artwork was another way for Brown to displace himself as an artist. But by claiming the piece, he nonetheless establishes his importance. He didn't create the physical drawing, but he did create the idea behind the drawing. And he seems to be claiming that the idea is far more important than its material manifestation. This piece can also shed some light on why Brown withheld so much information about himself. During my conversation with Annie, she talked about how Brown did want his work, especially This Way Brown, to have an audience.
So we know that as of the early 70s, he decided to not give interviews, not show up to his openings, not offer the artist biography in his catalogs and shows, not provide images of himself or images of his work. And it's tempting to read that as a claim for privacy, and maybe it was, and many people see it that way. But the work also enumerates his steps, his own walking, his location, both in real and hypothetical senses. He also asks people to show Brown the way. So he's playing with that tension. And the work also thematizes connectivity, circulation, transportation in many ways, trains, cars, interplanetary travel, and interrelation. So it's not that the work is about withdrawal. He also didn't withdraw the work itself. He exhibited it. He also made these artist books that are very transportable and affordable. They're not meant to be expensive, although now the prices are going up. And he taught art in schools as well for many years, so he wasn't himself invisible.
Brown's work was quite personal, both in its creation and presentation. To make This Way Brown, he had to introduce himself to dozens of strangers. He then named the series of drawings after himself, and again signed each drawing. In a way, this undermines the desubjectivization theory, because Brown isn't removing himself from the work at all. He is the work. From a certain perspective, This Way Brown is a way for Brown to reveal his biography, just not in a way we've been trained to understand.
He has this quote. I'm going to read the quote. He had a solo show at MACBA Barcelona, which is the big, contemporary art museum in Barcelona in 2005. So they're asking him about the biography mandate. That's in an interview with the curator. He says, biography is dead wood. The work itself produces the interviews, writes the biographies. This attitude is material. Each millimeter, meter, and distance has its own identity.
Challenging the objectivity of measurement became a through line in Brown's work. He even created his own system of measurement based on his body. The length of his foot became the SB foot. He also created the SBL, the width of 6 of Brown's hands, and the SB step, the length of Brown's step. The idea of the body as a unit of measurement is nothing new. The L and step used to be units of measurement, albeit unstandardized ones. In England, an L was about 45 inches. In Scotland, an L was about 37. In Egypt, the standard unit of measurement was the cubit, or the length of the forearm.
It's interesting. He actually uses antiquated systems of measure, and most of them from what we would characterize now as the Global South. So, he's very intentional, right? And so he's using these kind of systems that are no longer viable in the world today or when he was living. And I always thought that was really interesting. It's almost like a kind of indigenous knowledge system to these particular cultures that he's using. And talk about, what are the stakes of using something antiquated, not within a Western system of measure, to do just that. And to me, that is a reminder of, it's almost, a really trippy way to think about it is a commentary on power. And if we think about it as most people don't think about the ornament, which is entirely the purpose of the ornament or how the ornament comes into being, is that you take a symbol, typically.
Over the course of the 20th century, advancements in transportation radically altered our experience of distance. The time it takes to travel between countries and across oceans shrank from weeks to hours. Our experience of distance becomes increasingly symbolic as we delegated the physical labor of travel to technology. We can read Brown's work with distance as a process of desymbolization. By tying distance to his body, he personalizes it. And by creating a new system of measurement, he reminds us that nothing, not even the metric system, is permanent. The ways we measure distance are political and have consistently changed from one era to the next.
It's a way in which domination is represented. So by Brown returning to the thing that no longer has a use, we can think about it in relationship to the way that measurement that is no longer in circulation could be readily thought about along the lines of an ornament. But he then repurposes it and takes it and uses it and shows its applicability, its specification, its usefulness in his time.
We can see more of Brown repurposing distance in his work View of a City in 24 Hours. The creation of the piece was recorded for a Dutch national television feature about new art forms in the 1960s.
They invited Brown to be part of the show, and the show kind of cuts to Stanley Brown rushing amidst a busy sidewalk of people commuting to and fro or going to work, going to appointments. But he is dropping down blank sheets of white paper on the pavement and then rushing back to gather them up after people or have walked over them or bikes have ridden over them. So it's this really great, almost slapstick sequence because there's a contrast between this purposeful, the usual commuters crossing the street, and then Brouwn kind of going against the current. But he has the same purposeful energy, but he's not rushing to get to an appointment. He's doing this sort of absurd task. And above this, also, De Ridder and Schippers are giving this kind of straight-faced narration about what Brouwn is doing. But then Brouwn ends up with these sheets of paper with the imprint of a pedestrian's footprint or a bicycle that has passed over it. And he exhibited these sheets of paper as well. And the effect of those is really, in some ways, haunting. There's a ghostly quality to the footsteps, but they also have this kind of quality of a photograph. So they're capturing a fleeting moment. They're kind of like a vector of movement. It's a register of someone's footprint, but it's also this moment and place that's a passage between one moment and another, or as Stanley Brouwn often referred to it, someone walking from A to B. So it's a dark imprint on a piece of paper. It's kind of like a found poem in some ways.
Like This Way Brouwn, the art is the artifact of an interaction, this time between someone's mode of transportation and the paper. Again, context is deliberately removed. We have no idea where these footsteps or bikes were going. We have no idea who left these marks. There's a tension created between the stillness of the image and the motion it implies. This work feels less personal than his measurement works or This Way Brouwn. Unlike those maps, Brouwn does not create all of the circumstances that produce the image. He lays the paper down, yes, but this feels more like an act of observation or collection than one of creation. Combined with the almost comedic video element of Brouwn dutifully placing down the paper, this piece feels like he is again challenging the role of the artist. Can an artist simply be the person who places the paper where it needs to go? Why is the person who directly creates the image not the artist? Brouwn, unlike the commuters, had the intention of creating art, but does this intention matter? After all, he never revealed the intention behind any of his artwork. Stanley Brouwn is provocative because he disorients us. He asks, can this be art? And does not wait for our answer. For him, the question is the art.
I think his curiosity was so profound that we don't know what was driving him, but I think we can see in the ways in which he was working that it was really about asking questions. Like, what would happen if we had more artists who were asking really hard questions about all of our presuppositions, right? Whether that's questions of identity or whether that's questions of where I show something or what I show, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I think that if he can teach us anything, it is that a genuine curiosity is something that can be profoundly productive, if not the most important thing in the creative endeavor.
Stanley Brown's art deliberately disorients his audience. He creates maps that make us feel lost. He identifies the tools we use to make sense of our world, whether it's biography or units of measurement, and renders them ineffective. He refuses to cooperate in systems, and in doing so, makes those systems more visible than they once were. I attended an exhibition of Brown's work. It was small, just 2 rooms. In one room, there was a series of white lines pointing in different directions. Next to each line, there was an instruction. Walk 2 meters in the direction of Warsaw. Walk 2 meters in the direction of Shanghai. walk 6 meters in the direction of Chicago. I participated, walking these small distances towards a variety of faraway cities. It was a quiet experience. The whole experience took less than 20 minutes. Still, it affected me. I became more aware of the space of the room and my relationship to that space. There was something poetic about moving towards a place but never arriving. We're always getting closer and farther away from places we're often not aware of. How often had I walked towards Shanghai while on my way to the grocery store? Do I turn my back to Chicago when I go to get my mail? Am I facing Warsaw as I record this voiceover? The next room was barren, save for a small quote on a white placard. It read, quote, "How empty is this space? All the planets, this including planet Earth, are in a constant shower of cosmic rays. In this space, just as in every building on Earth, it is also a case of raining cosmic rays. Walking consciously through the invisible cosmic rays in this space confirms, intensifies the presence of this space," end quote. As we end this episode, I want you to take a moment and think about where you are right now. Think about everything that has touched this space, the people, the sunlight, the air, and the microscopic creatures. Think about what is in front of you, what is behind you. How many steps have you taken today? How wide were those steps? Where did you come from, and what are you moving towards? Thank you for listening to this episode of Tomorrow is the Problem. In our next episode, we transition from the uniquely measured world of Stanley Brouwn to the work of David Madia, an artist who invites us to reconsider the boundaries between artist, artwork, and audience, fostering a more dynamic exploration of the ideas that lie at the heart of conceptual art. This episode of Tomorrow is the Problem is brought to you by the Knight Foundation Art and Research Center and is produced in partnership with Frequency Media. Our executive producer is Michelle Corey. Our producer is Lizzie Stewart. Our associate producer is Saranaz Jadbobai. Our scriptwriter and story editor is Isabel Moncloa Daly. Our script supervisor is Jessica Olivier. Engineering, editing, and sound design by Claire Bidigary Curtis. Visual identity by Julian Andrew K.A. I'm Donna Honarpisheh. Thanks for listening.